All right, good morning, good day, good afternoon, and good night. It's Ross Miller with Dr. Stephen Bourgeois of the Old School, sitting here waxing philosophically about the problems facing the American education system, as well as offering timely and relevant solutions, the kind of which can be implemented immediately and no doubt lead you to whatever. So here we are.
Thank you, Herr Miller. That was a great introduction. The first part really was. I was thinking, wow, did he write this?
I ran out of steam, though. I couldn't.
You did.
Couldn't think. It's too much pressure.
Well, and our listenership keeps growing. I've looked at the statistics, and it's mind-boggling how we've grown in the last few weeks. Why is that?
Well, I don't know, but I could be folding under the pressure. I don't think I'm going to, but perhaps just the thought of so many people listening, climbing exponentially from week to week. I think it's because you and I have a pretty easygoing interaction with one another, and we're talking about stuff that people care about, and they're interested in maybe a different idea. They've heard the same bit for the last decade or so, last couple of decades, and I think they're ready for something different.
Okay, I hope that's what it is, and not just you listening to it all day many times to get the numbers up. It could happen.
It could.
Where are we heading today, Herr Miller? I'll leave that to you.
Well, we're going to look at, and we're going to kind of compare the German school system, of which you're quite familiar with, and I certainly am, but not probably to the extent that you are. And we are also going to compare it from time to time with what the American school system does.
Sounds kind of boring and academic, and I already started to nod a little bit there. I just don't know.
No, it's going to be good. It's going to be good. We're going to fill it up with wit and wisdom, and then we're going to leave them riveted.
Okay. Well, I'm always a little reluctant, and that's kind of the German way. It's like when you give a compliment to a German, like you say, boy, that T-shirt is great. You know, the German will they're not expecting that, and they'll say, well, isn't it too something, isn't it too big on me or something? They always like to minimize that.
And it's always a qualifier.
There's a qualifier. I think that's rubbed off on me. So I'm kind of a qualifier in this conversation. I do occasionally look at our analytics for where the people are who are listening to us, mainly in the United States. Have this world
as you would
map.
Expect.
Yeah,
yes.
This world map. It doesn't get specific though, so we can't say if we have Hawaiians listening to us or Alaskans. Or
I like to think so.
If so, it would all like come from your address where you live and those multiple listens. But interestingly, when we click on Europe, there are 2 downloads from Germany.
All right.
Yeah,
that's good.
So there are Germans out there, but here's the other part. This statistic has a popularity, so do they like us pretty much, or do they see the whole or listen to the whole podcast? And
okay.
So for the United States, it's 97.5% popularity. So either they like us or they at least listen to the whole thing. But in Germany, those lone 2 listeners, the popularity is 2.5%.
Damn.
So they hate us in Germany.
Damn it!
I know.
I will admit, you started spouting numbers, and then I started to fall asleep.
No.
I'm not good at numbers
because we need to win over the Germans, and I think over the years, and we've been there together, as part of German exchange programs that we've led many times together, and I think have we turned off the Germans over all these years? I don't know.
I don't think so. I think you're quite charming in Germany.
Well,
much more so than America, I think.
Wonder why that is.
I don't know.
They could just be laughing at our strange dialect. I've been told that I sound like somebody in Bavaria a little bit, even though I've spent most of my time, in the central area part of Germany, northern. But I don't know why. But they say, "Are you from Bavaria?"
I have been told that my accent is not dissimilar to someone who's been locked in a basement for 20 years.
What are you getting at?
I don't know. So I don't know. I don't know if it's the way I'm saying my R's. I'm not quite sure. So,
Well,
and I don't even know how you have a kind of a litmus test of understanding of what a person locked in their basement for 20 years sounds like. But that's what they say. So,
well, I've never really been confronted with that question before. Um, so tell us about schools, and I think we should give the listener or listeners a little background on why we've spent so much time in Germany. How about why don't you start out, then I'll follow, and we'll keep it kind of brief because they're probably kind of interested, but they want to hear about schools.
well, for me, I mean, my first exposure to German culture and German language and Germans came from the neighborhood in which I grew up. But starting as a professional in teaching, I got involved in the international scene in Fort Worth, Texas, and they had a sister city in Trier. And then I started taking students to Trier, which is in the far western part of the country near Luxembourg, and it kind of grew into that, and not only grew as far as the language, but also my understanding of the culture, the history, but then also how the schools work. And so then in 2008, you and I made our acquaintance, and then from that point, you and I started taking students to Germany, and now I do it on my own, but not on my own, but
Oh,
sans toi. But
that's right. Because you essentially, well, you did take over the program that I took over. So I when I came to Texas, a gentleman had a long-standing exchange program that really started in 1960. And so when I came along in 1994, I actually had a full-time German position and inherited this program that had, it was one of the first, during that period of Cold War, and a little bit dicey to go to parts of Germany. So it was quite a big deal. But I took several groups to Germany and hosted. So you do both, and the idea is that you let the students learn what it's like in their counterparts' shoes, rather than doing a tour and staying in hotels where you have limited experience with what it's like in a home. And so
right.
But central to that idea is the school, and so we spend every weekday in school, like the Germans do, and then they have some excursions mainly on the weekends. But I've done that with several different cities or schools in Germany, and it's really been a great experience to get to know what it's like in the schools specifically. So that's kind of our background, but I think, for how many do we do together? In 4 or 5, something like that.
Something like that, yes.
Yeah, and then you've taken it a little bit further yourself.
And I've also had the great fortune of seeing other schools, schools in Mexico, schools in Japan, because I've led a couple groups of students to Japan. So, I have some sort of frame of reference between how one culture does it as opposed to the other. But, I think there are certain elements of the German culture that permeate within the school system, and I think it makes itself obvious in the school system. And it makes it for an interesting experience to be able to just sit there and take that in, but also to try to learn from as well.
Well, we probably want to talk about our impressions of the students themselves. The schools, there's a lot of ways to go. A little background is that the German high school is called the Gymnasium, at least the one that we've visited. But they have some different options. So everybody goes to school for the first 4 years, and they call that the primary school, or Grundschule. And after that, they get to make some choices. And that's where, in the United States, we would probably get a little upset thinking, okay, you're doing tracking after 4th grade, but pretty much they do tracking after 4th grade. And they either go to a school that's going to lead to high school and college, or more of a trade school, but still an excellent education. So what do you think about that in general?
Well, keep in mind, that's something that, for listeners who are of our age, in our 50s and, maybe older, this is something that actually used to exist here as well, where, every high school, every academic high school was usually accompanied by and adjacent to a trade school. And so So you had an option. You had an option to either spend all your time at the high school, or you could then also then go and learn how to fix cars, or learn how electrical systems, or what have you. You can figure out all that sort of thing and get it and pick up a trade and pick up a skill and pick up certification. That used to be how we did it, and we've kind of gone away from that. But the Germans have not, and perhaps it's to their credit, because one of the things that I kind of bemoan in within the American high schools is kind of a dismissal of the trade schools and a dismissal of the skills associated with the trade schools. Because now it's all about everyone go to college, whether you want to or not. It's regardless of your own personal interest. We want you to go to college, and so I think the Germans kind of keep those tracks open, and that's a decision for the students in Germany. It's a decision for the parents, and I actually don't mind that element of it.
I think that we can have another conversation down the road about college prep in the United States. I think if we talk a little bit about Germany, we'll see that they talk about internships in some of these trade schools, and I think we mention it, but often we don't really connect the dots. So it's an internship with meat, but these are real companies that potentially could give them a job later. And that's the element that maybe we don't develop as well as we could, at least right now.
You had, of course, my school is a little bit different in the sense that the district in which I teach has developed an entire center for in part vocational training, but also other things as well. And so that's still alive, at least in my neck of the woods. But I think we're a bit unusual in that regard. I don't think there's a lot of places that are putting that kind of emphasis and putting that kind of money into that kind of education.
Well, and I think we do have a tracking system. It's implicit. It really starts in middle school. It depends on how early you take Algebra 1, for example. If you take it in 8th grade, you're pretty much going to be taking advanced courses, honors courses, whatever you want to call them, AP. And that's a form of tracking. It's just not, official, but we really do have students who are maybe 20, 30% on that track. So it's not that different from the numbers in Germany. They're pretty even as well on that grouping.
So what about, what are some of the elements of, and we talk about it in general, talking about the fact that, there is the kind of the Grundschule, the kind of the beginning of things, and then you start going into different directions based upon where your interests lie. Given how much time you spent in a gymnasium, which is kind of the college academic preparatory version of high school in Germany, what are some of the observations you have, some of the things that have either impressed you or mystified you as to how the German school system, at least at the high school level, to use an American term, how that works?
It feels like we're jumping back in the 1950s. And I haven't visited schools in the 1950s, but the idea of rows of desks, really traditional teacher-led instruction, much more than we do here. I'm sure there are more modern applications now using group learning and so forth. But for the most part, you see the teacher holding court, the students taking notes, and lots of serious testing, mainly essay testing. But I think the most interesting is that the students quite often remain in the room and the teachers move to the student. So that's a big difference. And it's a psychological difference, one of ownership, because it's really the student's room and they're there in that place, and then a different teacher may come in. And that's not always
the teacher. Yeah, the teacher is actually the interloper here. Whereas, from my point of view, my room is my room. You're walking into my domain. But in Germany, the feeling is the opposite.
That's right. And I can remember sometimes, early in my teaching career, I didn't have a designated classroom. I moved here and there, and I was really using someone else's space. But in Germany, it's pretty stark. You don't have any decorations on the walls, for one thing. My image, and probably yours as well, is a chalkboard, and so they're probably catching up in the last few years, but really very standard. And they have the windows that open out, and and so forth. But we've been to
God,
some
I love those windows.
You miss those? Well,
I love the windows. I wanted to get them in my house. I love them.
well, they know what they're doing with those windows. But they can't handle warm weather. They send kids home, by our standards when it's probably 85, 90. They
But what's
announce.
interesting, and here's what's interesting: we talk about, and this is a subtle difference about how Germans view and treat quote unquote children.
Mhm.
So what you're referring to is what the Germans call a Hitzefrei, which is basically when they call off school because it's too hot. But there's degrees of that, no pun intended, because if you get up to a certain point, what they'll do is they'll dismiss the kids who are younger than, say, 12. And 12 and over, you should be able to handle it. You're a big kid now. Suck it up, deal with it. More is expected of you than what's expected of the little kids.
So with those announcements, the kids are sitting there with bated breath. Are they going to, fifth grade, sixth grade, where are they going to draw the line?
Exactly.
And so they're sweating in a different way, wondering, do we get to go home?
My students love the Hitzefrei.
Yeah.
Because we live in Texas where it's 180 during the day. And so they just assume, man, if we only had Hitzefrei, and they're just blown away by the concept of it.
Well, but they're a little bit tougher in the winters. We'll cancel school for a week if we have 3 inches of snow. And so they're used to that.
Or if the water goes out, or
right. But as far as teaching in Germany, my observation is that the requirement is that a teacher is certified to teach 2 different subjects, often quite different. Maybe you teach Latin and maybe you teach mathematics, something like that. But that's part of their training. So by definition or by requirement, the teachers have a broad range of knowledge. And often they teach different grades, which is unheard of, that you'd be teaching 5th graders and then later on you teach a high school history course.
Right. I think that to your point about the idea that they're supposed to be trained in 2 different areas, there's a couple of things about that. One is that it creates a broader base of knowledge with which the teacher can present a lesson, or present examples, or present correlations and things of that nature. But also the fact that sometimes the different fields of discipline are disparate, and so you might have what we would term here in the United States a more humanities subject, and then you would have a more scientific subject. And to me, we've talked about this before, the idea that, in the United States, we have very delineating thinking. That's a math kid. That's a social studies kid. That's a, history kid, whatever the case may be. But in Germany, at least in my experience, there does not seem to be that delineation. Everything folds into everything else. And each subject provides context and support and justification for all other subjects. And it's like a self-fulfilling, self-aggrandizing, self-building of each and every single subject, all meshed into one.
So having teachers who can do that, over here, it would be pretty rare. So it's great talking to teachers in Germany. Remember the faculty rooms. You've talked about faculty rooms in the United States. It's a place where new teachers should, just keep out, because you're going to probably quit if you sit in there too long. And those rooms are largely empty, during the school day in the United States. So before school, maybe a little bit, or at lunch. But in Germany, they set up. They have like all these tables laid out, and they have their little stations with their books and all of their paraphernalia. And they're in there a lot. And so there's a lot of conversations between faculty members, because when they're not teaching, they go in there and they prepare. Whereas,
that's the key too. That's the key, in that the faculty room serves a different function in Germany than it does in the United States, where in the US it's seen as a respite from the job.
Right.
That's why you can go in there and bitch about it all day long. And then in Germany, it's a workspace, because again, teachers don't have their own classroom. This is where they work, and they usually have tables where they can work together, kind of a more of a collaborative type of thing.
It's really something that we miss out on. And I think that because we're sequestered in a classroom all day, And imagine a career where you're around kids, which is great. But then when the bell rings at the end of the day, you get in your car. So you're really not interacting with adults nearly as much as probably we could or should.
And that has a detrimental effect in a couple of ways. One, it kind of creates a lack of cohesiveness among the staff. Because we're all busy, we have busy lives, and outside of school, that's our time, and off we go. All those folks backed into the parking space,
Ready to roll,
and so you're ready to roll. But there, it's a different kind of vibe, and there's a different kind of spirit that's kind of associated with the way in which teachers work together, and it's not like that's unheard of in U.S. schools, and certainly. You see it a lot, particularly in mathematics and science, where the demand to pass tests have created kind of more of a demand for teachers to collaborate. But here is kind of more of a forced issue to some degree, based upon quote unquote test results. Is being done for different reasons. There, it's like a genuine collaboration among professionals, discussion of ideas, discussion of methods, and what have you.
So it's really professionalizing the profession. And they're compensated as professionals also. I mean, they certainly make relatively more money than we do. And they have an incredible retirement. I mean, they're called an official, an Beamter, which means that they work for the government, and that when they get to the age of retirement, they're taken care of. It's quite different. I don't know the numbers, just how dramatically better it is there, but they get paid more. They're certainly treated by the public with awe. It's a real different dynamic as a teacher over there.
And if you want to compare it to the United States, it's a tricky thing, because I think, every time I meet somebody and I tell them I'm a school teacher, inevitably, somewhere along the line, the conversation will go to, oh man, I could not do what you do. I have so much respect for you. Now, I don't take too much out of that, as far as, I appreciate, of course, that anyone says anything nice about me, my profession, and what I do. Of course, I'm a gracious individual. I don't mind, being gracious towards that. But it seems like that only happens in isolation, or it only happens within a certain kind of framework or societal situation. I think beyond that, I don't know if there is a great deal of respect as far as what teachers do and how teachers do it. And part of that goes to how teachers are treated by politicians and higher up education officials, and to how teachers have kind of screwed the pooch, as it were, as far as like how they behave and how they interact and how they have to conduct themselves in their job. That's not something you see as much. I'm not here to over romanticize how great a German teacher is, but there's more is expected of them.
Well, also more is expected of them before they can become a teacher. They have a much longer internship. I mean, it's really a paid internship where they're gaining confidence and getting a lot of feedback. But, you've talked about these signs that say you come and teach, these billboards. They don't have any billboards over there. They have to get these college majors in subject areas and a lot of practice teaching. So it's a pretty desirable field to get into.
It's a desirable field, and as you say, they are compensated for their efforts. And we talk about the fact that their job is considerably harder than ours, only because, or one reason is because U.S. system tries so hard to find shortcuts in every imaginable way. Both in how they fund, but then also how teachers conduct their classes and how administrators encourage teachers to conduct their classes. I wonder about some of the other aspects of the German system. For example, our system is known as nothing but test. But in the German system, there's only one test that matters. Can you speak to a little bit about the Abitur?
This is really the test at the end. So the gymnasium, the academic high school, goes through the 13th grade, and I mean it's comparable to having 7 or 8 AP tests in 1 or 2 sittings, and so there's just a lot more rigor. I hate that word, but they have high stakes imagine taking those AP tests with the caveat that if you don't get a 4, which is 4 out of possible 5, you don't graduate. Meaning you have to either go into the military or the workforce right now, or you go back and repeat a full year.
Right.
And so the stakes are really high. I've probably told you this story before, but there was a student, when I was visiting, and I was invited to the student's home by the parents, along with the teacher with whom I was staying, the head of the program, my counterpart. And we had a wonderful dinner, and then we went to the living room and talked about the student, and they were wondering what could be done because the student failed by just a couple of points overall on this abitur. And those were the options, go to the military, go back and repeat your whole senior year, or potentially a trade school or something. But, we don't have that kind of stakes. I mean, we talk about high stakes testing, but we really don't have that kind of concern on the part of a student. I mean, they get a 3 or a happy 2, as we sometimes call them on the AP test. No harm, no foul. And those actually are not even recorded in the grade book. They either get college credit or they don't. So the differences are stark as far as that goes.
And not only does a student run the risk of not graduating, but even at the higher level, should they score high enough to graduate, there's still a question about whether their scores will be sufficient enough to get into the school that they want so they can pursue the vocation that they want. And sometimes they have to consider different vocations if they cannot get into school, or they just have to leave the country and go study someplace else, depending upon what their language skills are. But there's like multiple layers of stakes attached to this one test. Now, the test is not just sit down and take a multiple choice test. How's it broken down?
Well, there's just a lot more writing. It's essentially a writing test. That's all it is. And imagine rolling in 6 or 7 or 8 AP tests, but also the SAT in a way, because you mentioned the college entry. They have specific numbers that they require. At each school, their universities are relatively streamlined on that. So you get into specific programs based on a number from high school. And so that's just out of our world here. We consider college applications and high school almost separate, except for your class ranking and GPA, which does matter.
Right. So you have this one part, the written test, or what's called the schriftliche test, and then you have the mündliche test, the kind of the oral part of the Abitur.
Right, and that's a part that I've never obviously observed. I'm not as familiar, but they would have to sit down in front of teachers and defend their knowledge. Very intense and probably lots of preparation and gnashing of teeth on the part of the student to do that as well. But their own teachers grade, but they have a standard, and so they have it's almost like a blind review. And those the jobs of the teachers are on the line. If they grade, they have lots of checks and balances. But at the time of Abitur, there's a lot of grading, and Germans, the teachers are used to grading essays, and they do it all the time. But what a stressful time, and then ideally the students graduate, and that's when the fun starts. And in a way, college is much easier than their equivalent of high school.
And you see this in other places around the world too. And one of the school systems that I am familiar with, at least enough to make this comparison, is in Japan, where high school is so strenuous, high school is so challenging, that university is almost kind of a kickback, as it were, where you can just take it easy a little bit. It's not nearly as demanding. You can cut loose a little bit. And of course, in American schools, American colleges, you can cut loose too. But the problem is that this is where the demand really kind of steps up in the American structure, whereas in other places, not the same.
Well, I'd like to talk about the student, and we can't help but generalize on American students and German. But something occurred to me I didn't want to miss. You mentioned administration.
Right.
You know, we've been at several schools, and the structure is the school tends to be an entity, not part of a school district like we have
Right.
necessarily. So it's autonomous to some extent. But the idea of central administration, or even think of the layers of administrators on a campus, that
Exactly.
everybody teaches. The head of school is the first among equals, meaning they
Mhm.
do teach, and they're promoted typically from within, and they may be promoted to assistant director, and then they get to direct the school. But they're not, they don't go through training and administration. They learn it on the job, and very, very different. And you don't see these levels of, all these vice principals and counselors, and quite different on the structure.
And you mentioned before, going to Germany is a little bit like going back into the 50s
Yeah.
because and I think still in kind of small rural schools today, but in general, schools 50 some odd, 60, 70 some odd years ago, it was quite common for the principal to still be teaching classes, that the duties of a principal was done in conjunction with the duties of a teacher. And a principal listening to this today said there's no way in hell that would happen. I don't have the time to teach class in addition to their job as principal, and they don't. And that's either a good thing or a bad thing. And I think it might be more a bad thing because once you leave the classroom, we talked about this before.
Right.
Once you leave the classroom, what is it like? 1 year out is like 5 years in real time.
Oh, believe me,
The
I'm there now. Yes.
and so for a principal, it becomes more challenging because they're not actually in the classroom. I mean, it's not like they don't remember what it was like to be a teacher, but they're kind of cut off from their teachers in kind of a real sense because they're so inundated with the demands, the politics, the money, and everything else that goes into being a principal.
Well, following state testing at every level, like our school leaders have to do, that there's a emphasis on the teacher and the teacher's grade, and we've spent
Right.
a lot of time talking about the grade book, but there's very little complaining, even acceptable complaining. The teacher is always right, and they'll talk to parents. Don't get me wrong, but they have such authority compared to what an American teacher does in that conversation, that they win that conversation, almost all the time.
And then you transition from this to something you just mentioned a few minutes ago. How would you describe the difference between the average high school student in suburbia, Texas, with the average German high school student?
This is the part that I was afraid of, trying to generalize, because there
Right.
are knucklehead Germans and knucklehead,
Sure.
Americans. To give an example, just it seems like I guess my short answer is that the Germans seem more mature. And I think they're given more freedom. Here's an example: when you get on a train in Germany in the morning, quite often you see a group of students. So they jump on a public transportation and they take that line down to their school and they get off. So they're not on a school bus. I mean, they have buses, but still they use public transportation. So there's just a lot more. They seem to they grow up a little bit faster there. In the classroom itself, they're not coddled. The interaction with the teacher can be fun, but it's also pretty intense. And there's very little praise. So it's matter of fact. When one student will say something and then they might acknowledge it, but then they move to somebody else. There's a lot of raising of hands. So students are participating or they're not, and they're taking notes, but it couldn't be more different. I think, over time, that creates a more mature student because this is what I wrote my dissertation on. They become more engaged in the topic over time. And I think because of the lack of praise and little short-term rewards, but that's kind of you've had conversations with German students and you feel like, you're almost talking to even more than a college student, but they can talk on a pretty high level, and that is surprising. And I don't know if we can blame our system or our students for not getting to that level, but just imagine the linguistic ability to have a conversation in English with an American teacher. So their language skills are better, and it just translates to a well-rounded student who grows up a little bit sooner, I think.
I think about our shared favorite German colleague, who is lovely and impressive in every sense of the word. She's quite an amazing teacher. But the way what she demands of her students is kind of typifies a little bit of that spirit. I think once she realized I was willing to engage politically, I think she was always kind of keen to have her kids come talk to me about all matter of things. One, because I don't mind talking about it. Two, I have the skill set to discuss it. Three, I tend to try to stay even keel as far as my approach goes with my students, and just willing to engage. And the fact that those kids can engage in that way, one of the things I always tell my students before we go to Germany or before we start a program, I said, you need to be prepared. These kids are not like your colleagues here. I mean, now again, you're right. They're German knuckleheads and they're American knuckleheads. But I think part of it, and it's the example also holds here in the U.S. Part of what makes those students different within the German system is also the German culture and what it demands of quote unquote students. It's the same thing here. We don't demand as much. And again, that's a very generalized idea, but both from a student point of view, but also what is expected of young people in our society. Not a lot's expected and a lot is tolerated. And in Germany, that's not the case. And so in Germany, students are raised to try to become as independent as quickly as possible. This is a fun discussion for parents, especially parents of young children, as I am. One is at what age do you send the kid down to the corner to the grocery store to pick up something, right, to pay for it, pick it up, bring it back?
College.
College. But in Germany and France and other places, the expectation is that they're doing that much, much earlier, 5, 6, 7 years of age. And that kind of gives you an idea about how early the expectations began to mount for a German young person in contrast to an American young person.
I'm glad you said that because, the school has a role to play, but just how they're raised, the fact that they have a drinking age, for beer and wine at 16, that I'm not touting that as a great accomplishment, but it just shows that that they're, thinking of a more mature individual at that point.
Right.
I remember being in class. I mean, this happens a lot. When we are teachers, in Germany visiting, we can do a couple of things. We always meet with our own students, kind of have a pep talk and, try to talk them down from their stress and all of that. But we're making sure they do what they're supposed to do and not wandering around the town, but actually going to class. I mean, that's, it's crazy we have to do that, but we did. But often we'll go into classes, and I think that's, if you get to do that, you should take advantage. And so you and I have been in many German classes, and, sometimes we'll just sit there and observe, but often they'll involve the guest. And so they'll tell the students, do you have any questions? You have a chance to speak English if it's an English class, or German if it's another class. And it's stunning how the hands go up immediately, and we're answering questions. They're good questions most of the time. And that dialogue could go on for hours and hours. They have actual questions. Replicate that here, bring the German teachers into our class. You've done that. How does that go?
Well, I think it depends upon the kids. The most remarkable thing about being an American school teacher is how different, the class dynamics might be from one class to the next. One class might be particularly reticent to speak, and another one might just be boiling over with enthusiasm to speak. But I think that, well, I'll explain it by this. Oftentimes we have to write recommendations, and kids will ask us, can you write a recommendation, what have you, for college, scholarships, whatever the case may be. And one of the things that I will sometimes note in these scholarships is the kids' ability to speak to adults without any nervousness, without any apprehension, without any reservation. And I mention that in recommendations because that's the exception rather than the rule. A lot of times, in an ordinary ad hoc situation, some young people are not inclined to speak to adults or lack the ability to do so in a competent sort of way. And so I think when you see one and you come across one, first, it's exciting as the teacher, but two, it also kind of gives you a glimpse into what other school systems might demand of their students and what it would be like to have a room full of folks like that.
And in high school, we think of seniors as seniors, but they're still kids. But add a grade to that. I mean, that 13th grade is really important. So those 12th and 13th graders they're adults. You're talking to adults, and so classroom management, feels very different in Germany than it does here. I think that with the younger kids, they're trained. So as the teacher walks in, in many classes still they stand up.
Right.
But
I tried to bring that to the United States. It didn't work out so well. I just like the idea of kids standing up, like I was a judge or something. But
I think I did that too, teaching German here. It usually deteriorated, and and they took the standing up too seriously, and I don't want to get into it, but it was uncomfortable. So I stopped. The other thing I used to do, and I'd be called racist today, or whatever you want to call it, and it'd be inappropriate, is giving German names to my students. So somebody's name is John. No, my name is Johann or Günther, Helga. It was completely cliche. And a
pretty standard fare with foreign language instruction, is it not?
But, for 25 years, maybe 2 of the years, I caved and did that because the students would ask, "Can we have German names?" And I said, "I don't even know your name, your American name," because I'd ask at the beginning. And so I'd have to, and if I see the kid out in the hallway or something, I say, "Hello, Helga." It's absurd. So I just didn't have the memory for it. But I doubt that in Germany, they're saying, "Hey, Tom," using American names. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I've never heard that, but who am I? What do I know? But I've never heard that in Germany.
No, that
hey, Bob.
Yeah.
Bob, John, Johnny, Sally.
Yeah. It's actually something I've never talked to our friends in Germany about. Do they think that's a good idea, or are we getting into something that's a little uncomfortable?
I'll bring it up next time.
Why don't you?
I will. So it's all for the podcast, So
well,
I could see this being a series.
A series on the Germans?
Oh no, not necessarily on the Germans, although we can certainly do that as well. But to kind of look at other schools and other school systems around the world, just to kind of see, how they do things, because I think it is kind of cool to kind of observe how other cultures and other peoples have approached a problem that we might be experiencing here and how they've dealt with it. And certainly there is a lot to be learned. To wrap this discussion up, can you think of, and I'm sure there's more than one, but let's stick one idea out there. Is there any aspect of the German system that you think either one is ill-advised or two would never work here?
No, I was saying that it was perfect and we shouldn't change anything and we should adopt it here. And that's me buying time because I'm trying to think. I think the early tracking is something that would never fly here.
Right.
Making a decision of a really some significance after 4th grade, we don't know.
Right. Right.
And there, we're barely doing standardized tests. And when we start in 3rd grade,
right.
And what happens then if they get a low couple of scores? Well, we're sending you to a trade school.
You'd be a plumber.
Yeah, but we would have to be set up for that, and we'd have to have actual choices and fields. So that part is a little bit concerning. I think that you'd get a lot of pushback, because even now when you look at the different schools, the Hauptschule, which is kind of the everybody who's not in the college prep, but it's a big group. A lot of the students there tend to be immigrants. And so there's some bias in selection, and it's a scary thing. If we did that here, you're going to be based upon socioeconomic status, probably race, and have a lot of problems, and I mean, it would go through the roof. Even if we recommended it. So I think those are the main things. But as far as in that classroom, I do like the dynamic of the teaching, because it's pared down. There's a lot of discussion, but not a lot of gimmicks, so by gimmicks, what do we mean? It's moving, group work, and all these things that can be used to be effective, but not as a methodology across the board. And they think that the student needs to prepare, they need to do their reading, they need to do lots of writing, so their assessments are written. Teacher needs to spend all weekend grading them. So that part, I think we would get pushback from the teachers. How many of your teachers, in your department would want to be grading essays all weekend?
That'd be a tough sell. I mean, of course, a lot of teachers do it, AP teachers and the like. But I think not just teachers, but teacher unions. I think that would be. I know you don't want to necessarily weigh into those waters just yet, but I think teacher unions would also be a serious roadblock to some of these ideas. And so, certainly good things, bad things. We do tracking too. We just do it for different reasons, and somehow that's more acceptable. For example, academic tracking and gifted and talented. We just had a video we had to watch. My kids in first grade, and they're talking about advanced mathematics, and this woman, to me as a first grade parent, mentioned the SAT. And she goes, "This is going to be great training for kids. Is taking the SAT." And I'm sitting there going, "What the hell are you talking about the SAT for? My kid's in first grade." I mean, just let's consider the surroundings here. Why are we jumping like this? And of course, this is a whole nother podcast. I didn't mean to get into these weeds, but the idea of tracking, we accept tracking to a certain extent, and then we accept tracking not accepted in other instances, but. So certainly the idea of tracking is not unfamiliar to us, but this kind of tracking, right? I think you're correct. I think it would be very problematic here in the U.S. So
it would be tricky.
It would be tricky.
Our students, our high school students, think about class rank. They have it on the brain. I'm number 6. I'm number 12. In Germany, they don't know where their ranking is. It's none of their business. And so then it never comes up, because they have a test with some teeth at the end that'll determine their ranking. It's based upon that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a lifelong obsession. It's something that just hits at the end. But I think we've had some pretty good discussion about the German school, and I'm sad that I haven't been there in a while because of current situation and conditions. But hopefully to be there very soon again. So, and hope you get there soon again.
Well, I may just at one of these times go back just for old time's sake, and as we know we have a lot of friends there.
We do.
But still, when I pull up those analytics, the 2 people who hate us in Germany, as far as the podcast, what did I say? 2.5% liking.
They're
us?
still listening, though, right?
No.
Okay.
They listened to about 2.5% of the podcast. I think that's probably how it's set up, and they turned us off.
Oh dear.
Was it our pronunciation?
Right.
I don't know, but something really touched a nerve. So I think this, the Germans are good with giving feedback, so I know you have a lot of friends out there in Germany. So do I. They'll probably say, well, Ross and Steve, you have this wrong. This is actually not true. So they're pretty free with their feedback, particularly to us. I get a lot of feedback from Germans for years. Getting a complex now. So
That's what the Germans will do to you. So
They will. But we've gone through this without any really bad or inappropriate jokes. I'm proud of both of us for that.
I didn't think I'd make it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I thought you were going to do some silly accents, but it didn't happen. So,
hello, mein Herr.
Oh no! we need to stop that.
Damn it! I thought I was going to make the whole podcast without doing that.
You were close.
Damn it! All right, very good. All right, Herr Dr. Bourgeois, are we ready to close this thing out?
Herr Miller, I think we are. And should we say Auf Wiedersehen or Auf Wiederhören? Which would be more?
Wiederhören, I guess. Yeah, Auf Wiederhören would work too.
We'll hear you again.
Yes.
So let's hear each other again.
So long, Herr Dr. Bourgeois.
Thank you for not singing.